And the roots just broil over the sidewalk and broil over the curb there into the street and buckle the street. I mean, they're super trees. You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. This is your co-host. Tony's not here today, but this is your co-host, Billy Brown. Feel free to get in touch with us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. You can find us on Facebook.
So I am Laura Roman from the U.S. Forest Service, Philadelphia Field Station. And this is Jason.
And I'm Jason Lubar. I'm the Associate Director for Urban Forestry at Morris Arboretum of the University of Pennsylvania.
All right. So we are also joined by my daughter, Gilda, who might speak up here and there and work into the podcast. We'll see. She's a pretty mellow baby, but she still likes to talk, and I worry that Laura will not be able to complete the interview.
Making googly eyes at her.
So, my first question I wanted to ask is, well, actually, I'll set this up by saying I met Laura almost a year ago at an event for our day jobs. Well, this is about your day job, kind of, but not at all about mine. But I saw the table with Forest Service people, and I had to chat them up because it was a lot more interesting because no one was coming to this event, and we were sort of tabling and talking to nobody. In any case, we got to talking about what I talked about the podcast a little bit and writing for Grid Magazine, and you were talking about Forest Service stuff, but also your interest in London plane trees. Mm-hmm. And I have my usual reaction to London plane trees, which is I don't like them very much. And I don't know if I have logical, reasonable reasons for not liking them. But like I was talking to Tony about this, which the co-host of the podcast. Where for me, like I think of them as the tree equivalent of hostas, which
They're
for me
all
are
over the place.
It's what you put somewhere when you don't have the imagination to put something more interesting there. So, which might be way too harsh.
We may come back to that theme.
So this is also going to be kind of like a convince me kind of podcast. But I'll start off by asking, what is a London plane tree? Does it fly? Is it from London?
I'll give the first part of the explanation and let Jason chime in and then tell you about the confusion in the past, which relates to why they were so popular. So it's a hybrid, Platanus x acerifolia. It's a hybrid between the American sycamore, Platanus occidentalis, and the often called oriental plane, Platanus orientalis. That hybrid emerged by accident, I think 17th century, but nobody knew about it for a long time. Nobody knew that had actually happened. Botanists took a very long time to figure it out. Anything else you want to say about the hybridization?
And the first plant record of it was described in Spain. That's why the new Latin name is Platanus hispanica.
Oh, thank you, Jason.
And but that's still under debate. But the at this point, that was the first description, so that name takes precedence.
Aha.
And you'll also see Platanus acerifolia without the X, or Platanus orientalis, like variety acerifolia in some of the older records.
So the leaves look kind of like a maple? Is that why the acerifolia?
I would guess so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Because the orientalis has larger leaves, lots more lobes. It's a very interesting leaf, whereas our American sycamore looks sort of like a sugar maple leaf, generally.
It does, yeah.
Right.
But they're also rather hard to tell apart when they're young. And from some study that was in Pittsburgh some years back, I don't know if you heard of this one, there was a lot more genetic variation in the past in the London plane. Whereas in the last few decades, it's been a few cultivars planted that are probably much more genetically similar. But in any case, way back when these trees would have been planted that we're standing under, we're near the Rodin Museum in downtown Philly.
Yep.
These trees would have been called orientalis.
Okay.
So people who were planting these trees in the 1800s up through the early 1900s, planting records at Philly Parks and Rec, formerly from Park Commission, they were listing as orientalis, orientalis, orientalis. And why that matters is because the Oriental plane was famous in ancient Greece.
Okay.
And so these descriptions in these old forestry textbooks would go on and on about the importance of the Oriental Plain to the Greeks.
Got it.
And also talk about how the Oriental Plain was at that time like City Beautiful movement era, when there was this big push for city beautification, making big boulevards. They would talk about how the Oriental Plain was so popular already in Paris.
So with so cities with sort of classical like tastes and pretensions, and like having big Greek trees, or okay, I get it.
Trees that were already very popular in London, very popular in Paris, and meant something to the ancient Greeks.
Okay.
Right. And they were very
Do you think that's
adaptable
cool?
to
Yeah, you think that's cool.
very adaptable to urban conditions too.
Yes. Yeah, so that was another thing that came up a lot in the old, again, these old like horticultural texts and magazines and nursery catalogs and forestry books. They would say the London Plain they would say the Oriental Plain can tolerate city fumes.
There you go.
So they were talking about pollution, and that's why it supposedly did so well in London. You'll still see that today.
Right.
Today, in like any kind of arboricultural guide to trees, the London Plain got that name because it could do okay in London with the fume. And I don't know, I think people get the history a little mixed up sometimes because, like you said, new things learned about Spain. But and it also had this reputation of being pest and disease free.
Okay.
Back in its heyday of when everyone thought it was Oriental Plain.
Right. And today, what happened was these trees evolved in the floodplain. So
which is where you see American sycamores
right.
today.
You see them
classically in river quarters.
Right, on river quarters, the bone white branches and trunk of our American native sycamores just line wetlands and wet areas. You don't see them anywhere else but there, naturally. Yes, we have planted them in gardens and arboretum and our landscapes all over the place. But in nature, you only see them down by the creek. And just imagine that. It's the soil is very granular. It washes away. Ice flows come and hit the trunk. And so the wood fibers had to evolve to withstand all those slings and arrows of natural forces. And that's one of the reasons why they do so well in our urban environments. They're used to compacted soil. I mean, that's a big problem in our urban setting. We're standing on the soil now. We're compacting them. These trees can tolerate that because they grew up in the floodplain. They can tolerate pollution, and they're actually really good at capturing pollution. You know, these are our large trees. You look around, what are the largest trees here? Mostly are London plains.
Mostly, yep.
Yeah, and they capture the pollution. They slow down the air, and the particles of pollution actually get deposited on their leaves, where rainwater washes them into the soil.
I do need to point out, though,
that I pause really quick just to do some quick baby stuff.
We're all snug here. There we go.
Right, we've resumed recording. What were we saying?
I don't remember.
So you were talking about. We've gone through sort of the
ubiquitous of the plains.
Well,
they're everywhere.
You were talking about the American sycamore and
the
its
genetics.
virtues.
So So when did people start noticing these?
I was about to say something. That's right. I remember. You were talking about all of its virtues in terms of the wonderful things it does as a large tree. Also, allergens. So they have these little hairs on the other side of the leaves, which I don't see any on the ground right next to us. They've probably been swept up because it's a very landscape kind of area.
Yeah.
But they have these little hairs that are, I mean, they're on the list of things you'll get tested for if you have seasonal allergies. Platanus is one of the check boxes. We just got my husband and my daughters tested for allergies, so I noticed that.
That's a downside.
It's a downside. And also, what's kind of amazing to me is this has been recognized for well over 100 years. So some of these descriptions that would tout, super tree free of pests and tolerates city fumes.
But the one problem.
But it happens to have these things that'll irritate people. But it wasn't mentioned that often. And part of why I think this is interesting is because most other trees had downsides mentioned more regularly in these old records.
So an old records question I have for you.
Yeah.
And so in the podcast we've done episodes like about the house sparrow and how it was introduced in the sort of mid-late 1800s to combat inchworm infestations of urban trees. They called them something else back then. Basically inchworms. Yeah. Moths, looper, whatever, that were that people saw as just annihilating all the urban trees. How do the London plains? I mean, was that part of the thinking that they were resistant to? You said that they were recruited not to have pests.
Right, they were pretty disease free. However, they do. Like our native sycamores, they get anthracnose. which is a leaf fungal disease, which usually comes about when it's cold and wet in the spring. And the leaves, it gets on the leaves, it kills the leaves, it gets into the twigs and can cause what's known as witch's brooms, which are distorted growth. And then the leaves fall down. Everybody's like, oh, the tree must be dead. It's no, it just has anthracnose. Just wait a few weeks and it re-leaves. It leaves out again and it dries out and everything's fine. There's also powdery mildew the leaves can get, which is a white mildewy substance on it that can cause the leaves to curl and fall off. And these are pretty common for these trees, and some are much more resistant than others. That's why they're making cultivars now, to make them resistant.
But those are non-fatal, right?
They're non-fatal. The tree can usually live through it. Now, if you get anthracnose year after year after year, the tree is like a battery. It's holding energy from the sun. It needs that energy, and it's like a battery. So after successive years of anthracnose, it can run the battery, quote unquote, down, and the tree can suffer that way. But usually it's a non-fatal, at least in the short term. Okay. But we can treat these. If you have a problem with your London plane, you can treat them either by spray or injection. So it's actually better for the tree if you do that every once in a while. That way the tree has its leaves, and you recharge the batteries.
So what about So I say this knowing in my own mind, I like having trees around that have bugs on them to some extent to feed birds and other things. But I know that's also a downside when you're choosing a tree that'll be hardy and survive for more than a few years on your corner. And I'm looking right here over your shoulder, Jason, and I just with the way the sky is, I can see little holes in a lot of the leaves that we're looking at. Are those from pests, or is that?
It could be from pests. There are things that skeletonizers or beetles that eat the inside of the leaf. Then there's the inchworms you talked about, and other caterpillars that can eat the outside of the leaves. So these are used, especially the older ones, very importantly for habitat. We're in a urban setting. There aren't really that many large trees around, and large trees provide that habitat with hollows or places where squirrels can live and places where birds can live.
Pause for 1 second.
Are we mowing here?
Pause. All right, so we are recording again.
Hello again.
We had to move. We had to jump art museums. So we were next to the Rodin Museum, which I guess is part of the Philadelphia Art Museum organizationally. Yeah. And then we are now sitting in front of the Barnes Foundation, thank you. Barnes Foundation, which is a relatively old institution, but new location here on the Parkway, but still has a bunch of London plane trees.
Yeah. And I wanted to mention, because I don't think we stressed this enough earlier, just how badly Philadelphia wanted to be Paris. So we are on the Ben Franklin Parkway, which is the imitation Champs-Elysees.
Right.
I mean, it explicitly imitates that boulevard, that grand old boulevard in Paris. And so the French Connection, this like wanting to be a European style cosmopolitan city, just can't be stressed enough. And in the old reports from the Fairmount Park Commission, which started controlling street trees in 1912 and had been in this kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, they were building up the park system all across the city. So in their annual reports and the annual reports of the City Parks Association, Paris gets mentioned all the time. And not just Paris, but Paris and its street trees. And Paris has so many street trees. And, this is how much they spend taking care of them. And shouldn't we be doing that? And, they have so many street trees. And this many of them are Oriental plane, again, with the species confusion. And what was really fun, actually, like a little sidebar for anyone listening who either is from Philly or familiar with Philly, there was such a Philly attitude to these old reports. It was, we're going to be very kind of self-deprecating and like all the things wrong with our city and how it's managing its trees and all that. And then when the Parkway goes in, it was, we're the best city ever, the best thing any city's done this century. It was very like this, hate on our city, but also think it's the best city and no one else should pick on it.
Yeah, and it wasn't like Philly was a rundown poor city. That's when Philadelphia was like a big industrial.
Sure. But we had been overtaken by Washington politically as a political powerhouse, by New York population and commerce-wise. So there was already this sort of inferiority complex that came through to me loud and clear in those early records.
And I'll just point out the French thing. We went from a museum dedicated to Rodin to a museum that's full of French impressionists. So
And the architecture down here is very inspired by the Beaux-Arts tradition, and the gentlemen who planned this landscape, Paul Cray and Jacques Rébert, who designed the Rodin Museum and designed the Parkway and designed Rittenhouse. They did a whole lot of other stuff. I mean, they were French-trained architects, landscape architects.
Yeah.
So the French connection runs deep, and there was also the importance of Philadelphia being the center of botany for such a long time, the center of botany and horticulture in all of North America, I think. I mean, it was called the cradle of horticulture. I don't think we're the leaders anymore. I mean, we still have a lot of important institutions, but
we had started off with the Bartrams and
Bartram, Hamilton. So having all these really important people, and again in this kind of turn of the 20th century time frame, there were different people that were from France or from England, and they were, some of them, saying things about the plane tree, this oriental plane they thought it was. And I mean, I wrote down one little quote for you guys. A guy named Thomas Nuttall, he was an English botanist, ties to Philadelphia. He carried on some of the work that Michaud did, who was a French forester botanist. He wrote in 1842, "This tree deserves to be planted in the United States." So I find it really hard to believe. 1842.
Yeah.
I find it really hard to believe that people in Philadelphia would not have been aware of that fact, that he said this in this important book. And then a botanist and entomologist, Macquart, if I'm saying that correctly, from France, he said in 1851, "Oriental plane is one of the most celebrated trees." And then by 1912, that kind of same language is making its way into a report from a shade commission in New Jersey. So I think there was this kind of perpetuating of this just love affair with the Oriental plane. And again, the elm was also getting quite a lot of attention. The American elm is very important in terms of U.S. history. Right here in Philadelphia, there was according to legend, apparently it didn't really happen, historians have been telling me, that a treaty was signed between the Lenape Indians and William Penn under this gorgeous old American elm, memorialized in...
You were talking about the elm.
Yeah.
The elm, not elm theme.
Right. So cities in New England and the upper Midwest got overloaded with elms, just like we got overloaded with planes. Now, lucky us, the planes haven't all died like the elms all died from Dutch elm. But, I mean, people have investigated the elm much more in terms of urban forestry scholarship, because it was such a traumatic loss when they all died.
And sort of coming on the heels of the chestnut loss. Also.
Right. And so different cities still retain names, like New Haven is still called Elm City.
Yep.
But so the elm was so celebrated, and there were some elms here. I mean, there were elms native here. There were some elms planted, but it was nowhere near as popular. So in some tree planting records from the city that I found from the 30s and 40s, the plane tree was like 40% of all street trees planted, and the elm was like 2%. And why I think this is that, again, these botanists in Philadelphia, nursery growers, people like Thomas Meehan, different publications from this, huge array of people with botanical expertise, they were saying, well, the elm has this beetle. And it is elm leaf beetle. It is well before Dutch elm disease came about. But, you have to spend money managing it. And another recurring theme in the old reports was Philly doesn't have enough money to manage anything. So you had this kind of, well, let's plant something that doesn't require as much resources to take care of. And then there was also this idea of the kind of climate tolerances. So even though we do have elms that grew here natively in our city, the descriptions would say, the elm doesn't do so well this far south, and likewise it would say, the plane doesn't do so well up into New England. And I'm not totally sure how true that is, but I still see it in current horticultural texts.
Some of this, I mean, some big old American, and I hope those are Americans that I'm talking about now that I say it, but like in Baltimore, I remember some just like groves of huge elm trees that I thought were sort of survivor Americans, but I'm not.
Or maybe they've been treated. I mean, like the huge one on the Penn campus has been treated.
Yeah,
it's a descendant of the treaty elm.
Washington D.C., I remember around the
elms,
White House, some massive
and
elms.
up in New York, the elms of Central Park.
Yeah.
So I think climate-wise, you could have some elms.
Right.
I think so too, and I've also seen plane trees do just fine further north. But then there'd be these reports of like, oh no, all these. Or again, Oriental planes, like all these Oriental planes, had frost problems in New York City. But New York City has tons of planes now, and they're hugely popular there too.
Isn't that the symbol of the park system in New York?
Yeah,
London
plane leaf.
Yeah, sort of a London Plane maple mashup.
Yeah.
But the point is that these considerations of what trees belong where are based on the lived experiences of tree professionals.
Yeah.
And so we are sitting under the artifacts of their decisions and what they thought was suitable for where. Some of it has to do with, all those kind of urban stresses Jason was talking about earlier, and some of it has to do with, the reality and the perception of climate, pests and diseases, so on and so forth.
But again, it's one of the pretty much a bulletproof tree, and that's why you see it planted, and that's why you see here, these are long-lived trees, and if everything remains the same, which it never does.
Oh, come on.
They'll last.
I think they're just getting the leaf bags.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
But yeah, we do have to tell you about canker stain, so it was actually banned. I didn't realize until I started this research. The London Plane tree was banned in the 60s.
Anyway.
All right, let's turn back on. You were talking, because we, on our walk over from one art museum to the other, as we were trying to evade the landscapers, you were pointing out on what looked like an American sycamore,
Right, and it had what's known as canker stain on it. And this fungus, it's really virulent in Europe. I mean, it can cause a large London plane tree or plane trees to die 2-3 years very quickly. In here in the United States, it seems to be chronic and may cause death eventually, but for some reason, and I haven't figured this out yet, it would be a great study, it's not as virulent here as it is over in Europe. So, as Laura said, it was banned, the plane tree was banned because of canker stain and the worries, because it was just sweeping through Europe, as it still is in places, killing trees. But here we've seen trees with it 10, 20, last 30, 40 years. But the problem is, when you have a tree infected with canker stain, an arborist comes, and the arborist uses his or her tools on it, saws, what have you, and then goes and prunes the next London plane. And what happens is the fungus has little sticky spores on it that stick to your tools. And you're spreading it, and I've seen it actually spread down lines of London planes or sycamores when they're doing street tree pruning.
Oh, because they're just going quickly. And
they're just going quickly, shearing off branches.
The idea that you have to clean your pruning tools has been in the suite of arboriculture best practices for decades now. Since the mid 1900s. Again, I've been reading through all these old records. It would be like, all right, so the canker stain, big problem, but okay, we can fix it by removing trees when their infections have gotten really bad, and then cleaning our pruning tools, going from one tree to the other. But
does it happen?
Right, does it happen in real
sometimes.
Life?
Real arborists, not real arborists, but the larger arborist companies, and a lot of smaller ones too, know this and will sterilize their tools.
Yeah.
It's when you get in a situation, I think, with utility line clearance, they're just going down the line. They have to spend this much time on it, so they don't really care. Right.
Yeah. And it's entirely possible in terms of the different levels of intensity of canker stain here versus Europe. It's entirely possible that our population of London planes have a bit more of the American sycamore in them. Right. I mean, because the canker stain is a disease from the U.S. It was actually found in Pennsylvania in the 30s.
So it could be one of these endemic, non-fatal things.
Right.
Trees.
Right. Or it could be the disease itself is changed genetics over in Europe.
Some combination.
We don't. I've never read anything on that. It would be a great research opportunity.
It would be really cool, and I would think that folks in Europe would want to investigate this because, again, this having been an iconic tree for so long in different European cities and settlements, they're quite worried. I mean, for the last 15, 20 years, there's been a bunch of, the canker stain, and we always think of the diseases coming over, say, from Asia and impacting our vegetation. So now we're sending something over to Europe.
It works both ways.
Yeah. But so the canker stain issue, again, first arose in the 30s. I found some things from USDA talking about canker stain, such a problem. And then I'm not entirely sure when this disapproval or ban started in Philly, but by at least the early 60s. So I found a newspaper article from a former head of arboriculture in Fairmount Park, Bob McConnell, saying, all these things about planting street trees in the city, and we have to take care of them, and who wants to get a street tree planted in front of their property, but we won't approve of that plane tree anymore. And also the species confusion was continuing because it was called the London plane and the buttonwood, which is another name for the American sycamore, or it was called the plane. So anyway, the tree that is ubiquitous on our streets, London plane or whatever we want to call it, right? He would say, oh, all this canker stain problem, we've already had to remove all these trees because of this problem. We're not going to approve it anymore. And yet they were still planted. They were still planted in the 60s, and what he told me on a phone call, so he's buddies with Lori Hayes at Parks and Rec.
Love Lori.
He's in his 90s now, and she chats with him now and then as sort of a mentor relationship. And she brought me over to her office. We called up Bob McConnell, and I thought that he was the one planting all these plane trees. I thought that it was like the city. This was before I realized there was a ban. He said, no, it wasn't me. I like the ginkgo. And he was saying all these things he liked. And it makes sense, though, because he was very involved in the ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture. He would have been very aware of problems with the plane tree.
Yeah.
And it also, I didn't ask him, but I would think he'd be aware of the push for more diversity at that time, like 60s, 70s. But he said...
So you don't have, one species everywhere that's hit by a pest.
So this monoculture problem, whether it was the elm tree that happened to, or the plane tree, where to some extent it's had these problems. But so he says... No, the developers would put it on their plans. I would disapprove of them, and they'd go above my head to City Hall. And my mind just blew, because that's such a thing that could happen in our city where developers get their way. But it's also, I think there's this underappreciated role of housing developers and real estate in the selection of street trees. So if you think about where you find massive amounts of plane trees, not where we're sitting on the parkway, it's more kind of museums and commercial.
Yeah.
Think about row houses with row after row of London planes, and the trees are roughly-ish the same age as the housing.
Yeah.
Who picked those? The developers.
The developer was, yeah.
And also in the records from the Fairmount Park Commission, before this ban was in place, back in 30s, 40s, there were these columns of different categories of planting. So there was planting different species, and then planted by the city, by the commission, planted by permit, which always outnumbered planting by the commission. And who was getting the permits? I haven't been able to find a paper trail of the permits, but I'm guessing a lot of those permits were new housing.
Right.
Also interesting, planted by the Works Progress Administration. So Works Progress Administration was doing street tree work, not just rural conservation. Depression era plantings. Yeah, and so I think that relationship between developers and species selection continues to this day, because again, I haven't seen a lot of literature on it, but just from talking to arborists, you hear these things come up in arboricultural conferences and such, that in subdivisions, in suburban subdivisions today, instead of one tree, you'll have 3 species, and they'll alternate every other yard. They won't be street trees, they'll be yard trees, but still, it's who's picking it. They don't have an arborist on staff usually. I mean, the arborists get annoyed, why didn't you talk to us early on? It's usually the developers, maybe an architect, maybe a landscape architect, and they're usually hamstrung by what's available in bulk from the nurseries. And so you take that same kind of dynamic, put it many decades past when the push was for monoculture, not any sort of diversity, and the push was for bigger shade trees, not smaller ornamentals, and you end up with, in our city, tons and tons of London plane trees.
Which is not a bad thing, and that's what we push diversity, and we understand diversity. But these trees, look at them. We know they survive and thrive here, so we shouldn't stop planting them, but perhaps we should plant less and less of them. But here it was used as a statement. Here's the grand boulevard.
Evocative of Europe.
Right, and it has to be uniform, and that's something, if you notice the trees in the middle, these are new trees in the middle, there is diversity there. The city picked 3 or 4 trees and planted a diversity trees to mix it up a little, but still have the uniformity of structure and form that we see here today.
So what are we looking at? We're looking at what kind? Just over.
There's oaks. There's red oaks, Shumard oaks, maples. What else was there? Did we plant lindens? Yeah, I forget. There's might be lindens in there too, but it's and you can see the form. If you stop and ask people wouldn't probably notice. Your tourists walking by wouldn't notice the diversity.
Yeah, I also think there's a real value aesthetically to monocultures on a particular block.
Right.
I mean, you risk if something comes through killing that block, but if you can have block-to-block variation. But this idea of the uniform structure, kind of cathedral effect, they'll call it, which also can trap air pollutants.
Right.
That's hotly debated now amongst ecologists and epidemiologists, is the mixed relationships between the trees
on the way
and air
over
pollution.
here, I was walking by one of the towers on the south side of the parkway, and they have like, or where was it exactly? But it was like a triangular section of land which had all been planted with honey locusts, and it had a nice kind of like uniform. It was uniform, but it had a very nice effect. You know, it's like I'm partisan of the honey locust also, but I just wish they planted them with the thorns. Like I love those thorns so much, and it's like I don't know if it's a real practical problem with people getting impaled on the thorns.
Yeah, well, when you first plant them, they can be at eye level, and that's no good for anybody, getting stuck by one of those thorns. And that tree, it's interesting. You go up to that tree and you touch one of the thorns, and it's amazing how sharp it is. How did that get so sharp? Why does this thing have thorns? And you realize these trees evolved back when there were the megafaunas. And, the large ground sloths trying to get at the seed pods.
Those are thorns for mastodons right there.
Right.
And it's
keep large things off.
Great book, Ghost of Evolution.
There you go.
The author's name I'm blanking on right now.
That sounds cool.
Look up Ghost of Evolution. It's all about basically trees, American trees with features evolved for extinct megafauna. So, like the Osage orange has fruit that were not meant for white-tailed deer, right?
Yeah, right.
And even the pod, I guess deer eat honey locust pods, but still, the thinking was that they were more mastodon or ground sloth food than.
There's a tree-related book club that our colleagues at PHS run. I'll have to check that book out and see if they want to add it to their to their list.
Great book.
It is.
Well, one thing I'd like to say about the wonderful plane trees in our city,
as we convince you that they're
I mean, look at the bark. It's very nice bark. They can be architectural if they're pruned that way, but look at them in our streets, in our city, in the highly populated areas. And the roots just broil over the sidewalk and broil over the curb there into the street and buckle the street. I mean, they're super trees, and it's amazing to see these old trees that are now like in the street and people can't park next to them.
But then have like, only a few square yards of what looks like a few square yards of free space, and they're all the rest of it's concrete.
But the roots have to be somewhere.
I know.
The roots of these trees have to be, where are they going? Yeah, and they're just going underground. They're finding it. Because Philadelphia, we're not up high.
Leaky
it's not
sewer
well
lines.
drained
Yeah,
here.
they're tapping into the sewer line.
Yeah, and water line leaks. And also, we have a lot of really great mulch. This concrete mulch, it keeps the water trapped underground in the streets. So the water stays underground and doesn't get a chance to evaporate.
Sidewalk from an arborist perspective.
Yeah.
But for what it's worth, though, with all these problems that can emerge in terms of disrupting sidewalks and whatnot as the trees get massive and old, the newer tree plantings along streets are not these huge shade trees.
No, they're picking these little...
They're picking little things.
And I love service berries. I was eating service berries on the way over, but it's like a tree of that size or...
But so there's this right tree, right place concept that is really being pushed in relation to overhead utility lines, but it has to do with more than that, of finding the tree that is suitable to the conditions at the site. But...
And won't cost like $10,000 to take care of for arborist
but
fees.
So with the increasing push for smaller stature and also more ornamental trees that residents ask for,
we're losing the shade.
We're losing the shade.
Right.
Yeah, we're losing the shade, and we're losing all these other benefits that these huge trees provide. And once they're taken down, I mean, I think, and I would imagine a lot of other colleagues in professional arboriculture and research would think that we're having this shift away from street tree populations dominated by large shade trees. The Norway maples, the elms that have already all died, ash are coming down in different cities, and then here we have London Plane, and now they're getting replaced.
Oaks that get really big.
They're getting replaced, if they are getting replaced at all, which is a different matter, right? But when plantings are happening, they are much more often your smaller, to me, and maybe Zelkova, maybe something that's a bit more medium, but you're rarely getting these large stature trees because people say, a city like Philadelphia, we don't have your wide tree planting lawn like you have in the Midwestern cities, right? We have these tiny soil pits, narrow planting strips.
We're in an unusual spot in Philadelphia in that we have this big buffer of grass.
Yeah.
If you're in my block in West Philly, we
hardly have anything.
Yeah. But there's so many blocks of West Philly lined with gorgeous old plane trees, and they're doing just fine. They're doing just fine.
Right. And these trees have, like these large London planes, they can equal the benefits from 100 or 200 smaller stature trees.
Oh, yeah.
And benefits you're talking about soaking up water, soaking up pollution, that kind of stuff.
Providing oxygen, providing shade, providing cooling. Yeah. And also there's people don't realize this, but if you have a large tree next to your house or at your house on the street, it actually improves property values.
Yeah,
these trees put money in your pocket by planting these large statuesque trees on your property. I know, yes, you need to take care of them and you need to sweep up, but look, people pay money to join gyms. This is exercise. You're getting out there, you're meeting your neighbors, you're talking, yes, you're cleaning up your trees, and maybe you're even taking that and putting it in your small backyard and composting and helping the soil.
Choir, man, yeah. And I'll point out as someone who's gotten into birding, number one, I've come to love oaks for what I see are warblers coming through eating them. But I'll note that I have seen it seems to be a reliable thing now that I've spent a couple springs looking at this, is orioles seem to love the seed pods or the seed clusters of the plane trees. So I've a couple times I've been walking around Independence Historical Park, which is near my office, and had like a little snow of London plane tree seeds drifting down. I look up when there's an oriole up there picking one apart. But even in West Philly, I'll see, I've seen a few. I'll just riding my bike to work and I'll hear, let's say, black-throated green warbler or a northern parula, and it's going to be in a larger shade tree. It's not in a
because these are birds that function in the upper canopy. They like the upper canopy. They don't like being close to the ground.
Yeah.
So you'll always have to look up to see orioles. And rarely do they come down and to the ground. So, the decisions we make on choosing our trees affect a whole bunch of different things like birds, wildlife, and even us.
And for many, many decades. I mean, when we talk about some of these different problems that have come from the trees, especially as they age, right? As they age, and they might disrupt different kinds of built infrastructure, or you might have concerns of when this tree needs to come down, how much it's going to cost, and managing the risk, making sure it's not going to hurt anybody or any property or any power lines. But the thing is, these are, I'm going to call them anthropogenically constructed populations. I mean, so much of the work that I do is actually not about history. So I'm a research ecologist. I largely study things like tree mortality and canopy cover change and stuff like that. But when we talk about tree mortality, it's removal. So we're talking about humans deciding what to plant, humans deciding what to remove. Yeah. So that demographic process, that process of population change and dynamics, that's all human controlled. And so, yes, we plant them, and then, yes, at some point we have to remove them. And it's partly just making sure that idea of plant, maintain, remove, replace is perpetuated in the culture and in the city management. It's very hard to do because, arboricultural work at the municipal level is underfunded, and it's but it's also hard to think that far ahead.
Right. You have to have sort of, plans being executed over decades, maybe hundreds of years. Yeah. It's hard at any scale to do that.
Right, and it's the temporal aspect is always challenging to cities around the United States. Just the money to deal with this, and also we're looking at climate change. These London plains, will they survive climate change? Well, probably they will for a while, but 50 years, 100 years, 200 years? I mean, the city should be around for 500 years, 1,000 years. What will we be planting in the future, and how will we look ahead to find tree species that are adapted to future conditions?
And we can be thankful that people who planted these trees selected these massive shade trees, right?
Yeah.
We can appreciate that, even if they're not still your favorite tree, right? But we can appreciate that we are sitting under shade, and we can hope that decisions are made today to allow the same kind of benefits for society, for wildlife, if that's your priority, into the future. Because one of the other kind of key things that motivated my research into this, aside from the curiosity of why plains and not elms in Philly, was that my fellow ecologists have increasingly been looking at things like spatial patterns in species composition, or in levels of diversity of urban vegetation, or in tree cover across or within cities, and then trying to correlate it against things like socioeconomic patterns, so U.S. Census data, or maybe they'll include topography if they think of that, or maybe they'll include housing age. But I look at that kind of analysis and I go, well, those trees weren't planted today.
Yeah.
Right? You want to investigate why we have the trees we have them and where we have them, we have to look at what decisions that were made in the past. So the few studies that have included things like census data from decades ago, that's better correlated with these different kind of urban vegetation patterns today. And again, something like species composition, it's okay, we could try to crunch some numbers across multiple cities, but ultimately it's a historical kind of analysis question. And who selected the trees? Why did they select them? And this issue of developers is something that, again, light bulbs went off in my head when I heard that on the phone with the old arborist the one day, but it makes complete sense. And so I'm trying to highlight that in this work that I have not yet published about the London Plane, but I'm working towards.
I was going to ask you about this. So are there something we should be looking to read?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Okay.
Not yet.
Keep tuned.
I have some other papers about history in urban forests, but not one that's specific to the London Plane yet. It's ongoing this summer. We're still digging in the archives.
But today, when planting street trees, that's governed by ordinances in a lot of the communities around Philadelphia and on the East Coast and, all across the United States. So they have tree lists. Here's what you can plant and here's what you can't. Some of these tree lists are from the 40s and 50s and aren't applicable today. We get hired to, update all these ordinances. And so that tree list is constantly updating, depending on what the performance of the trees are, what new introductions they are, and so forth. And so a lot of the street trees, at least, come from ordinances. And those ordinances have to pass through zoning, have to pass through design. And so there are places where we can sculpt the diversity of our street trees.
I'd like to point out, too, that there's having the ordinances on the books, and you know this, and then there's implementing them.
Right.
So one of the challenges in Philly with street trees, and this, relates to the London Plane, but also street tree management more broadly, is that you're not supposed to remove trees without permission.
Yeah.
But in reality, the fine is low and maybe not that well enforced. And our colleagues at Parks and Rec are thinking about this and thinking about it hard. But some other cities even have ordinances that cover private land, so you can't remove trees above a certain size even on private land, and we don't have that here. But yeah, I'll say because the fine's not going to happen. But when I was a kid, my parents removed a street tree from a friend of our house in the far northeast. It was a tree that had gone too big. It's a kind of 80s development, one of the last developments that happened in the city, area that has more twins and single-family homes. And you should really have your trees in the lawn and not in the 1-foot wide planting strip.
Yes, you should. Yes.
But so they removed this tree. I remember my uncle came over one day, removed this tree. I don't know, late 80s maybe this was. I don't remember exactly, but. Did they even know you needed a permit? Why would they know that? Yeah. It's not widely known. You would hope that the professional arborists that are hired to do. No, nobody knew.
All right.
Nobody would.
No, and nobody would have cared, frankly.
Right.
There were enough other issues in city budgets in the 80s, and for someone to go after city workers in a house.
Well,
in
you
Somerton.
mentioned that now, but Philadelphia does have a heritage tree program where any native tree or most native trees over 24 inches in diameter are heritage trees that offer some protection during the zoning review. And it took a little while, but London Plane was added to the list.
So London Plane
is the only non-native tree because the city realized, well, look at all these London Planes. What, is somebody going to cut them down? No. So we have to add London Plane to that list. So it's the only non-native tree.
Getting things in place in terms of procedures for tree planting and removal decisions can very much shape what species we have and how big the trees are.
Yeah. I want to thank Laura and Jason for joining us on the podcast today.
Pleasure.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook. You can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. Thanks so much for listening. Just wanted to make a quick note. Where we ended up talking by the Barnes Foundation. Seems to be a major house bench hotspot. I guess they seem to be nesting in the cracks that, or have nests, I think, in the sort of gaps and cracks around the facade of the museum, and are singing like crazy from the London plane trees right here.